I'm Mitch, and this is the podcast Journey of an Aesthete, of course. And that's the theme song for BookLunch. I'm going to talk a little bit now about this book and about many other things. First, let me show you the book. WhiteNoise by Don Delillo. I put Panasonic in the title because originally Don Delillo wanted to title his novel Panasonic. But the Panasonic Corporation was opposed to him doing that. So he settled on WhiteNoise, which is the kind of the ambient sound, the noise. It refers to that sonic auditory whatever that is. Any of that. This is the first novel I've done for the book launch, and I'm going to proceed rather differently than other book discussions, especially in fiction, in that I'm not going to give you really the plot of the novel. I'm not going to tell you, and it's not so. The reasons are interesting. So it's not so much because I want there to be suspense as to outcomes in terms of narrative, but it's actually that I want to de-emphasize, that aspect of the novel and sort of get into the more stylistic things. So this is from 1985, this novel. And as I have said in the past before, it's going to be a movie by Noah Baumbach with Greta Gerwig, and Adam Driver is the main character, and Don Cheadle and all those folks. And he's an interesting sort of, wouldn't be my first guess to direct a film of a DeLillo novel. David Cronenberg did Don DeLillo's Cosmopolis in the middle. It was with Robert Pattinson, I think. And that was actually that's interesting case of a film that is totally allied with the spirit of that particular novel, to a very faithfulness and integrity, and that's I don't think that common. So looking at the ad for WhiteNoise, I really love the visual sense. They're going for kind of a Stranger Things kind of 80s visual spectacle or spectacular style, and so visually I respond to that very well, but I can't comment on anything else. And we're going to dig into this novel and dig into Don Delillo. So I want to get into some personal storytelling. How did I discover this book? What brought me to this novel? So I read this novel in the 80s when it came out, and I read it with a friend of mine named Jack Wright. And Jack Wright and I played in the band at that time, and he's now he has a job running concerts in the city of Boston, and promoting concerts, producing concerts. Anyhow, in the 80s, he said, "Mitch, you got to check out this book, WhiteNoise." Now, I was not really that familiar with DeLillo at that time. I hadn't read Ratner's, I forget the last name of that word, in his early work. But I was really blown away by this novel. And one of the reasons I chose this novel is that it's about the world we live in terms of the stuff of the world, the environment, the detritus, the necessities, the design. But it's not about those things. And I'm going to hold up Don Delillo very highly. Don Delillo, and I'm not going to be coy about this, is one of the best living writers, full stop. Better than many other writers that one might prefer or might be more popular. And we'll get into, why I think he's so great in a bit. But what part of it is that when he writes a book about a midwestern academic family, so it's about Jack Gladney teaches at a university. His wife Babette, and then their kids in the 80s, and he's he's in a way having fun with academic trends of the 80s and sort of some of a little bit of, I say a little bit, not a lot, a little bit of the vanity and silliness of it, a little bit. So, for example, the main character teaches Hitler studies, and that was very starting to become big, is using the word studies. This was the very beginning of that, actually. That's the thing about Don Delillo, is he writes about things not only that are happening, but that will continue to be important or increase in importance. And Jack Gladney sort of has an antagonist of the novel, a fellow professor who wants to develop Elvis studies. And so they talk about Hitler and Elvis as figures. And so there's a kind of a little bit of humor in the novel. It's a little bit, I guess, functions as a little bit of social satire. But, and this is a big but, the novel depicts these people with, I would say, ultimately concern, care, understanding. And it's not only like, ha ha, these people silly. After all, Mitch Hampton, almost had a life like these people. I came very, very close to choosing for myself an academic life. So clearly, I don't think that's something that's unworthy of doing. And in fact, there's not a day that goes by where I don't, regret's too strong a word, but I often think, maybe I should have done this. And so clearly I, find the intellectual values of the characters. They talk about it. We'll get to that because they talk about intellectual things in the dialogue, which is fantastic. It's very rare in novels, not only because of who the figures are in the novel, that they happen to be not as educated to speak in this way, intellectual way, but it's just rare anyhow to have characters talking about movies and books, and all throughout WhiteNoise, characters are talking about film noir, and they're talking about all sorts of things. And also there's a theme in this novel that hovers over the novel, and that's the fear of death. And that characters are not only explicit about their fear of death, they talk about death, but there's actually some of the characters become addicted to a pharmaceutical drug, a fictional drug called Dylar, whose point is actually to get rid of one's fear of death, which is a novelist like Don DeLittle can invent dystopian world, sort of alternate worlds, even though he's writing in reality. It's in the 80s. It's not some alternate universe or alternate United States. It's very much rooted in, the United States of the 80s. Still, he's doing some very unusual things, like that choice of a drug. Or a big event in the novel is something called the Toxic Airborne event, and there's in capital letters in the novel. It's like there's this event that's toxic and airborne, and it sort of causes, social catastrophe, obviously. And so he's writing this in 84, I'm guessing, and this is long before a pandemic. But there's some similarities because there's a spill of some kind of toxin, and then everybody's panicking, and so that occurs. And another case of, so it's interesting. Don DeLillo, in his novel, I guess the thing I love, two things I get back to what I love about him, why I extol him higher than some other folks. And there's a handful of writers that I think, I won't give you a list of names of writers I hold really highly because I could, but I just want to stick to DeLillo, is that he writes about things that normally by an other author would be treated in a very tendentious way. In other words, there would be a clear case of, villains and heroes, and there would be a sense of, some kind of very clear moral lesson. And although this novel is unafraid of discussing very big issues, and things happen in the novel that are significant, there's a sense, again, that compassion, there's a sense of he's relating these fictional characters in ways that you could sort of understand where they're coming from. And that's actually highly unusual. Again, novelists, especially science fiction novelists, which he's not, but, state of the world type of novel, especially today, streaming television. Most streaming television shows about current events have this kind of, I would say, tendentious quality. They have a score to settle, or they're against academia or for academia, or they're for revolution, or they're against capitalism. No, in WhiteNoise, Don Delillo is interested in things in, I would say, an aesthetic way, actually. He's interested in them not as something to oppose or support, but just to experience, understand, and maybe kind of figure out where we are all going, in the sense that we're all kind of lost souls trying to figure things out. And that's sort of the underlying thing, even in this novel. Look at all these Post-it notes. I got all these Post-its. And I don't know if we can get to all these quotes in the novel. I like to get to a lot of them, because the thing about fiction, well, the thing about nonfiction too, about all prose, is the style, is the syntax, the sentences, and the feeling those bring the reader. And the way that the characters of this novel, as unreal or real though they may be, they cause something in you as a reader, if you're reading the novel, to experience that. Now, in 2008, I took a literature class with James Wood, and it was at Harvard University. I took a whole semester there for audited this class. And he had written a book called How Fiction Works. And in that class, we read V.S. Naipaul, and I think some Henry Green, a couple of Chekhov short stories. I don't really, again, it's fuzzy. I remember the Naipaul, the House for Mr. Biswas, I think was the novel. And James Wood had made a name for himself as a defender of what fiction should do, like the proper goals of fiction, almost a little bit like F.R. Leavis and Queenie Leavis. They were a husband and wife in the 50s and 40s who were very adamant about what fiction should do. And so, I went into this class, and I was studying V.S. Naipaul. One of the things I liked about James Wood, he's British, right? So he would come in, he would take out a text, he would say, let's look at a little bit of aesthetic detail. It's the first thing we would do, and we'd read a sentence. And so that's kind of a little bit like close reading. That part of James Wood I was crazy about. The part I was not crazy about that connects to this novel is he was on record as condemning a whole bunch of novelists for not doing fiction the right way, which in his term was, I guess, unreal or fantastic, or he called it hysterical fiction. And I think he was very hard on Zadie Smith, who wrote White Teeth, speaking of white, another very interesting novel. And he was and Thomas Pynchon. So I guess he was kind of hard on all the wild experimentalists of fiction, trying to do something different, trying to portray the world in its craziness and its chaotic messiness, and not doing it with the proper fidelity to, I guess, James Wood's I think it's English sense of, is this character believable, and what is the moral of the story and all that. I totally reject all of that of Wood. And I actually, Don DeLillo is very prolific. He's written Underground, Americana, Falling Man about 9/11. He's written about genetic engineering. I mean, he's written about all these things. And I think we should listen to Don DeLillo speak. I found a clip of him from 1997. And when he's talking about his own life, and he's talking about the aesthetics of language. And it's really very interesting. And then again, the context here, of course, is he's just published his great big novel, Underworld, which was a really, really major novel in the 90s. It's actually, of DeLillo's work, it's the one that's the most cited. It's the one that many critics consider his most important, even though he's done many things good since. I did not choose that novel. Again, it's a personal storytelling thing. It was WhiteNoise that appealed to me. Me and Jack would say, well, what do you think about these Midwestern teachers, at this fictional Midwestern university in Hitler studies, And so I thought I would play a clip of him speaking about his discovery of the Greek language It's really beautiful.
Very American voice.
And the way he
Your attention, please, for Don Delillo.
Can you hear it? He actually he speaks as he writes. It's great. Hope you can hear this. Sorry, it's not video. It's only audio.
I lived in Greece for a time. This was in the late 1970s and early 1980s. I was working on a book set in that part of the world. And in letters to friends, I liked to refer to Athens, a little ironically, as the ancient world. Nitric acid falling from the sky, angry traffic choking much of the city. Sometimes, on a quiet winter afternoon, at the end of a long, aimless walk, I'd find myself standing on the Acropolis. Between the gateway, as many of you know, between the gateway to the Acropolis and the temple structures, you can find slabs of marble just lying about haphazardly. I was just learning the alphabet at the time, the Greek alphabet, learning it like a child, only slower. But I like to study the writing on the inscribed stones. And even if I couldn't translate what was written on the stones at that point, I could study the letters themselves, the letter shapes in particular. It was a kind of visual art. The Greeks, in fact, made an art of the alphabet, a visual art. Years later, I began to understand that there's an odd connection between the routine days I spend at my typewriter and those deep afternoons on the Acropolis, when I was surrounded by words fixed for centuries in marble. I use an old manual typewriter, an Olympia as it happens. And I find it interesting that the mechanics involved in tapping out a line contain a certain sensuousness, fingers hitting the keys, hammers striking the page. There's a firmness of sound and touch, and the letter shapes that engrave themselves onto the white surface. There's a sculptural quality to this, and a sense of visual correspondence, the way certain words in a sentence seem to match each other pictorially, the way letters in a given word seem to strike a kind of balance or create a kind of symmetry. I began to detect a meaning outside the limits of strict content. Near the end of Underworld, the last page, in fact, there's a very long sentence, and near the end of this sentence, there's a certain phrase, the raw sprawl of the city. It's not simply that the words raw and sprawl look somewhat alike and sound somewhat alike. It's that the word raw is contained in the word sprawl, like a baby kangaroo nesting in its mother's pouch. There's an affinity, a blood relation that joins these words in ways outside their definitions, something that pleases the eye, a sense of alphabet art.
Now that's Don DeLillo talking about how he sees the world, not just his own writing. The raw sprawl of the city. So he's taken a phrase out of his own damn novel that he's just written. And so I'm going to read passages from WhiteNoise. And again, these characters are flawed characters. And you might not like the fact that they're teaching Elvis studies or want to. I mean, I'm a musician, so I think all music should be taught. You know, why not? I mean, why not study the meanings or the hidden meanings of Elvis's iconic status from the South or country or rock? I say we should. I mean, again, there's only so many hours in a day. You can't do everything. But I'm certainly, again, here at Journeyman Sleep Podcast, we're open to pluralism. And so there's surely as much of a place for Elvis as teaching about the evils of the Holocaust and Hitler. Both. So any event, I don't know where to start. Oh, here we go. This is when we first meet Jack Gladney and his antagonist Murray. And Murray's kind of, I don't want to say too much about him. Well, here we go. And it says Murray was new to the hill, a stoop-shouldered man with little round glasses and an Amish beard. He was a visiting lecturer on living icons and seemed embarrassed by what he gleaned so far from his colleagues in popular culture. I understand the music. I understand the movies. I even see how comic books can tell us things. But there are full professors in this place who read nothing but cereal boxes. It's the only avant-garde we've got. Not that I'm complaining, mind you. I like it here. I'm totally enamored of this place, a small town setting. I want to be free of cities and sexual entanglements, heat. This is what cities mean to me. You get off the train, you walk out of the station, and you're hit with a full blast. The heat of air and traffic and people, and the heat of food and sex, and the heat of the tall buildings. The heat that floats out of the subways and the tunnels. It's always 15 degrees hotter in the cities. Heat rises from the sidewalks and falls from the poison sky. The buses breathe heat. Heat emanates from crowds of shoppers and office workers. The entire infrastructure is based on heat, desperately uses up heat, breeds more heat. The eventual heat death of the universe that scientists love to talk about. It's already here, well underway, and you can feel it happening all around you. In any large or medium-sized city, heat and wetness. Mary, where are you living? In a rooming house. Is totally captivated and intrigued. So it's a conversation between me. Now, this is what Don DeLillo does. In the mouth of Mary are things that the reader might have sympathy with. Like, let's say, again, I really hate that. Everything he says, because I love cities. And all the things he's attacking are things I would gladly experience in an hour if I could, but I can't. And yet for him, these are all very negative things. So it's interesting. And it's, we'll get to Mary. We'll talk a little bit more about Mary, but in the mouth of a character, he has all these things. But yet if you're another kind of a reader, say who loves nature and has an idea that the city is negative, you're going to be right on Mary. He's on to something. And yet Mary is a very dubious character in this novel. And he's, well, again, I'm not going to reveal the plot. Later on in the novel, Murray has one of his many crackpot theories. He has many crackpot theories. Of course, this thing about cities, even though it's partly true, because cities have a problem with too much heat, and there's an environmental crisis then and now. So it needs to be said, right? And this is where, it's like having what is the thing in fiction where you give the antagonist, or you give the devil some good ideas and bad ideas, and et cetera. Not that I'm not going to say I'm not going to say. There's actually a long debate over how to understand Mary among critics in this novel. He says, he's talking to Jack. He says, I believe, Jack, there are two kinds of people in the world, killers and dyers. Most of us are dyers. We don't have the disposition, the rage, or whatever it takes to be a killer. We let death happen. We lie down and die. But think what it's like to be a killer. Think how exciting it is, in theory, to kill a person in direct confrontation. If he dies, you cannot. To kill him is to gain life credit. The more people you kill, the more credit you store up. It explains any number of massacres, wars, executions. Jack Gladney responds. He says, are you saying that men have tried throughout history to cure themselves of death by killing others? It's obvious. Now, there's a lot of passages in the novel where the characters say things like this, and you have to read it. And sort of the reader has work to do. So I'm going to go on the record. I'm going to say this, okay? I'm actually kind of angry at the fact that most novels actually don't really have exchanges like that with their characters. In other words, they may be otherwise really wonderful novels and they may do many things, but they don't. It's really odd because he's not considered a dialogue writer. I mean, when people talk about Delillo, it's not really necessarily for his dialogue. But you know, the people in this book talk about philosophic things and talk about life and death and the passage there. And even if it's horrific, even if we think it's, well, that's unethical or that's beyond the pale, he has them say it, you know, and you kind of have to deal with that. And there's passages in supermarkets. They run into a commune of nuns who are kind of an alternative, strange form of Christianity, even though they're nuns. There's a kind of I guess, fantastic / fanciful, sort of wacky, unreal aspect of the reality. It's like, you know, there's parody of bureaucraties and there's you know, all that. Okay, so there's this toxic airborne event and they're in their car trying to flee wherever they are and everything's chaos. And then there's an official announcement. And this is the person announcing, I want to welcome all of you on behalf of Advanced Disaster Management, a private consulting firm that conceives and operates simulated evacuations. We are interfacing with 22 state bodies in carrying out this advanced disaster drill. The first, I insist, of many. The more we rehearse disaster, the safer we'll be from the real thing. Life seems to work that way, doesn't it? Now, what's interesting is that this is like a drill, but there's actually a disaster happening. And it sort of confuses the characters in the novel. They're saying, well, there is a disaster. So why do you keep saying this is a drill and there isn't is there a disaster? Isn't there? Don Delillo is portraying our world to us. He's portraying our world in 2022, in 1984. This novel is the opposite of dated. I mean, this is the world we're in. And I really do think, I think that writers, playwrights, when they get something of who we are and what's going on, that's commendable. But on top of that is the beauty of his prose, you know, and there's I don't know what else to say. If you haven't read WhiteNoise, read it. If you want to go ahead and read Underworld or Falling Man, those are good too. This is the novel I picked. It's interesting rereading a novel that you read when you were just out of teenagehood or adolescence. You know what? I was 18. I'm 55 now. I reread it and I'm thinking, wow, you know, I just don't know. I mean, I think it's really something, you know, and I think that that someone can do that in prose. Someone can sort of take the world and take abstractions of the world, but avoid the trap of this kind of what I think calls the tendentiousness, this sort of Gothic mode. And the Gothic mode is sort of this, you know, kind of good versus evil, high stakes thing. This novel could have easily been like some of those science fiction novels where there's a villain, like this corporation that makes an announcement. They're not a villain. I mean, they're sort of, in other words, they're not like sort of, it's not like the Matrix where it's the opposite of the Matrix. It's a world where there are things that are wrong and things that are there are things that are wrong, there are things that are right. But it's not clear that it's about sides of the fence. In other words, it's an attitude towards life that Don Delillo has that's completely contrary to what we're all experiencing now, or what we bring into existence by virtue of our belief in what side are you on, you know. And it's interesting. I mean, I don't really want to get too political, but, you know, I live in North Carolina, and it's, you know, not every state, you know, I see these reports about, well, things are okay now. And I'm thinking, well, you know, if you elect a Senate, well, again, I don't, you know, there's as many reasons to be unhappy or despair as there are for hope. I'm just saying. And so, you know, and it's all in this novel, WhiteNoise. And it's 12:30. That's 30 minutes. I thought I was going to talk for an hour, but I feel that that's all I have. And so thank you, and I hope you get something out of this. And again, I'm going to try to do book reviews of novels, and when I do them, not sort of tell you what's going to happen necessarily, just give you kind of a feeling of the novel, you know, and leave it at that. And maybe it'll inspire discussion. All right, thank you, and have a good rest of the week.